please raise your right hand? You do solemnly swear the testimony you're about to give in this action shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God.
I do.
And can you please state and spell your name for the record?
Mary Kay Holthus, MaryKayHolthus.
We're on this way.
Did you get that? She said that really fast.
Yes, I got it.
I was a little nervous on this side.
Please watch your step. Don't sit close to the back.
Counsel?
Thank you. Good afternoon, Your Honor.
Good afternoon.
Are you currently a judicial district court judge?
I am,
How long have you been on the bench?
since 2019.
And were you elected or appointed?
Elected,
Since then, have you handled what we refer to as a mixed docket?
I have.
Can you describe what that is for the jury, please?
Means I do half criminal and half civil. So on some days, I'm doing civil trials and calendars, and opposite days, I'm doing criminal.
I want to focus in on criminal calendars. What types of matters are you handling on a day-to-day basis?
All types that come to the district court, which are basically felonies and gross misdemeanors.
Are there various types of hearings associated with criminal cases?
There are.
Would that include arraignments, guilty pleas, sentencings, revocations, and trials such as this?
It would.
Can you explain to the jury briefly what a guilty plea hearing is and how it unfolds?
A guilty plea hearing is when, obviously, most cases don't go to trial, they negotiate. And it's a negotiation between the defense attorney and the state. Defendant will enter into a guilty plea agreement. And then at the guilty plea hearing, we do a canvass. They review paperwork, sign off on it, and then we also engage them orally to make sure they understand everything they're doing and the rights that they're giving up in exchange for their guilty pleas.
Subsequent to a guilty plea hearing, is in the matter set for sentencing?
It is.
And what is a sentencing?
A sentencing is when they're going to be sentenced pursuant to negotiation or otherwise, whether they're going to get probation or prison. After we accept the guilty plea, we refer the matter to parole and probation. Parole and probation does what we call pre-sentence investigation report, criminal background, social background, medical background, all the history of the individual for consideration ultimately in passing sentencing.
Are there times in which a criminal defendant will appear in front of you out of custody?
Yes?
And are there other times in which they will appear in custody?
Yes.
As a result of that, are there some sentencing hearings in which people are remanded into custody from out of custody?
There are.
Are there security measures in place in the courtroom for these out-of-custody defendants as well as in custody?
Well, there's security in the courtroom. We have marshals and we have corrections officers watching. I don't know per se if there's anything special.
No, that answers the question. Are there times in which you will sentence someone to probation?
Yes?
Other times in which you may send them into custody, correct?
Yes.
When you sentence someone to probation, are they still monitored by the court in some way?
Not by the court, by parole and probation.
And what is parole and probation?
Parole and probation is the division responsible for supervising individuals that are on probation. They may have to report, they tell them what to do, help them find jobs, or put them in programming, get evaluations to see what kind of programming is best to serve that individual.
Are there times in which defendants who you've presided over will get probation, they'll go out into the community, and then they'll essentially mess up on probation and so on?
Yes.
And would they be brought back in front of you at that point in time?
Not right away. Sometimes P&P tends to work with them a lot of times to give them multiple chances. But at some point, when they get to a certain level, then parole and probation will put on what we call a violation report, saying that they're violating their probation. Judge, it's time for you to take a look. We think they should go do their time now.
And then that goes in front of you, and what's that proceeding called?
Revocation hearing?
At revocation hearings, do you essentially make a decision if the defendant should remain on probation or be remanded into custody?
Yes.
I want to bring you back to November 20th of 2023. On that date, do you recall whether or not you took a guilty plea from the defendant in a prior case?
I do not specifically.
Okay. When I say the defendant, do you understand who I'm referring to?
I do.
Who?
Mr. Redden?
Do you see Mr. Redden in court?
I do.
Can you
Sitting
please-
between his two attorneys over there at the table.
Would the record reflect identification of the defendant?
Okay, there's three gentlemen and he's.
The middle
right in
guy.
middle?
Yep.
Okay, let the record so reflect.
So as you sit here today, you don't recall taking a plea from the defendant?
I do not.
If I were to show you a document that memorializes that plea, would that maybe refresh your recollection?
Yeah.
May I approach?
Yes.
You may.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Oh my God. Oh my God, I'm so sorry.
So I'm showing you court minutes as well as a guilty plea from November 20th of 2023. Are court minutes essentially a record of any court proceeding that happens
They are.
in the courtroom? Do you recognize your name on there?
I do.
And do you see journal entry which suggests that you took the defendant's plea?
Yes,
Okay. And that would be on November 20th of 2023?
correct.
Do you remember which charges he pled guilty to?
Attempt battery, substantial bodily harm.
Okay.
That I remember.
Okay. And so, on this particular date, when you took the defendant's plea in the prior case, was he released from custody?
He was,
And was that pursuant to an agreement in the guilty plea?
correct.
When he's released from custody, I would presume he goes back out into the community, is that
He
right?
does,
And then you set a proceeding to follow the guilty plea?
correct. The
Well,
sentencing date.
Okay. And you talked a little bit about the sentencing date. You mentioned that you received some materials to review in order to prepare for a sentence.
Right,
And in this particular case, did you receive those materials?
I did.
And what were those materials?
Well, I always have the guilty plea agreement, so I know what the negotiations were, and the pre-sentence investigation report,
If
primarily.
Primarily, you said? If sentencing was set in this case on January 3rd of this year, when would you have prepared your calendar and reviewed those materials?
Sometime in the week prior.
And
Usually
so-
closer in time, so I remember. I don't remember, because it was a holiday kind of time, was our first day back. It may have been like the Friday before.
Okay. And so you know some things in advance about the defendant when you're going in to do a sentencing hearing, is that
Oh,
correct?
yeah,
Do you remember reviewing a PSI in this case?
I do.
Can you explain just briefly for the jury, when you're reviewing a PSI, what are the types of things you're looking for in order to determine the appropriate sentence?
Generally, the first thing, partly because it comes first in the PSI, is the age. Because depending on whether, if it's somebody older who's never been in trouble before versus somebody super young, a lot harder to send an 18-year-old to prison, to be honest. And just kind of, so age is what I look at first.
Continue.
And then I kind of peruse, is it somebody, do they have a lot of AKAs? That kind of gives you a little heads up. A look at the family background to kind of see what we're dealing with. Is this somebody who's had problems growing up? Has there been foster care kinds of situation? What's the family situation? A lot of times we'll have, dad's in prison, mom took off, raised by grandma, all those things that you're kind of mitigating maybe on some level the behavior, or trying to understand what you need to address and where you need to go. Obviously, one of the big things is the criminal history. I always jot down how many felonies, how many gross misdemeanors, how many misdemeanors, and then looking specifically at those, what types are they? Is this somebody who's got a drug issue that needs to be addressed? Are we looking at stolen identity of another, possessions of credit cards and stuff, which more often than not also indicates a drug problem, and where these crimes are focused. And then kind of in a separate category is violence. And sex offenders, I suppose, another one that are a little bit different.
Is prior violence an important factor for you when deciding whether to put someone back out on the streets or put them into custody?
Hugely.
And in this particular case, did you note prior violence in Mr. Redden's history when reviewing his PSI?
I did.
As you sit here today, do you have a recollection of any
I do.
specifics?
I know that when I did the PSI, he was about 30 years old, and his first criminal conviction was in 2012, battery domestic violence. So literally, he hit 18 and it's domestic violence on his record. And throughout the remainder, until I saw him again, he averaged one battery domestic violence conviction a year, always. He had 3 felony convictions. He had an attempt theft that actually started out, it was pled to an attempt theft, but it started out as a robbery, which is the violent taking of property from someone else against their will, a classic crime of violence. He had 2 battery domestic violence felony convictions. You get a felony after you have so many misdemeanors, they start becoming felony. He had a battery with substantial bodily harm conviction. He had a gross misdemeanor for malicious destruction of private property, which started out as a attempt home invasion, meaning kicking in someone's home. Again, pled down to the malicious destruction. I believe that was the one I had him on probation for. I didn't recall it, but I've since learned that he was in my department on probation for that, and I ultimately revoked him because of the case that I was seeing him on back at the time of the attack.
Okay, so that's a lot of information.
I know,
I'll
sorry,
note that
I
down. That's okay.
do that.
I appreciate that.
Okay, do me a favor, both of you, make sure you let him get his question out before you respond and vice versa. My court reporter is really good at what she does, but she's never mastered the art of taking down 2 people at the same time.
Yes.
Sorry.
In addition to criminal history, are you also reviewing the PSI to determine if that individual has had opportunities with probation, services, mental health treatment, and all those types of things?
Absolutely.
And in this case, as you perused Mr. Redden's PSI, did you see evidence to suggest that he had had several opportunities with the system when it comes to services?
I did. All of the crimes that we see, they're in a chart form, and then next to the chart is kind of what they got, probation, prison, violations and whatnot. And so you can tell that he had had probation a number of times, that he had violated a number of times. According to his report, he had gone through mental health court, had multiple sanctions and got in trouble a lot of times, but ultimately was passed through and graduated from the mental health court program. According to the PSI 2 times, he definitely had jail terms and he had been to prison for on 1 term.
And so you had mentioned a moment ago, you have since realized that you previously revoked his probation.
Correct.
I want the record to be clear about that. When you're reviewing his PSI, preparing to sentence him when the incident occurs, you don't recall that information.
No, no clue.
Fair to say there are hundreds, if not thousands, of criminal defendants who've come in front of you over the years.
Yes,
And you have since learned that you had previously revoked his probation and sent him to jail.
correct. And I don't know if I sent him to jail. I don't know if he was in custody and he stipulated that he had violated his probation. I mean, he may have been agreeable to it. I don't know any of the facts of that. I just know that I somehow ruled you're revoked.
Understood. I want to now move forward to January 3rd of this year. So on that date, you proceed into court for your criminal calendar.
Right.
Do you remember how many matters you had on that day?
I don't?
Were there a mix of both in custody and out of custody defendants?
Yes.
At some point in time, did Mr. Redden, was his case called?
It was.